Hey folks, how's it going? Matthew Dotson here from Maple City Firearms. So I'm going to do this quick video. I'm going to talk to you guys about how to safely make sure that your firearm is in fact unloaded, and if not, how in fact to unload it. Now, I'm just going to talk about handguns here today, but just keep that in mind. Your rifles are going to be different, shotguns are going to be different, and we're not going to discuss that in this video. Now, before we get into that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the firearm safety rules. Now, this is really sort of this video is really just for people who are new to firearms, so I think it's safe to assume that if you don't know how to unload a firearm, there's a good chance you may not have been familiarized with the firearm safety rules. So I'm going to go over those real quick. Understand that if you are going to own a firearm or be around firearms or go shooting, whatever the case may be, you should be familiarized with the firearm safety rules. If you take any firearms course through us, and hopefully through anybody else as well, they are going to talk in depth about the firearm safety rules. Now, there's three basic rules, but of course there's a lot of segues off of some of those rules into other rules. I'm just going to briefly discuss them real quick. Now, the one that always gets thrown in, and I always address it even though I don't really think it's a firearm safety rule specifically, is treat every firearm as if it's loaded. Now, this is great advice, okay? The idea being that you treat every single firearm safely as if it's loaded, and if you pull the trigger it were to go off. If you keep that in mind and follow the firearm safety rules I'm about to address, you should be set, all right? Now, with that said, the reason I don't call it a firearm safety rule is because it's more just of a mindset to go into this with. So, always treat the firearm as if it's loaded. Now, the first safety rule, in my opinion, is keep your finger off the trigger. I'm sorry, that's not the first safety rule. Always keep the firearm pointed in a safe direction. As you can see here, this firearm sitting right here is pointed away from me. There is nobody else in this room with me, so that is a safe direction for me right now. Okay. Second firearm safety rule is going to be keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire. Now, I'm going to discuss this one a little bit more in depth. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, the trigger on a gun is going to be right here, okay? It's going to look a little bit different depending on the firearm, but for this is a Glock 19 Gen 3, just keep in mind that is a trigger, okay? This right here is a trigger guard, all right? Now, when I say keep your finger off the trigger, I also want you to keep your finger off the trigger guard. Let me make sure you guys can see that. Sorry, I shouldn't have worn a black shirt for this video. The reason I want you to keep your finger off the trigger guard as well, once again, this is the trigger guard, is because what can happen is if the firearm has a particularly large trigger guard or you have particularly small hands, you go ahead and you have the habit of putting your finger on the trigger guard, but what ends up happening is your finger slips into the trigger guard and you could initiate that trigger, which would be a bad thing, okay? So you want to go ahead and make sure your finger is straight and off the trigger until you're actually ready to shoot. Not just when it's safe to shoot, till you're ready to shoot. That's one thing I talk to my students about all the time. Just because I've had you load up the firearm and you're safe to shoot, don't put your finger on that trigger until you've made that conscious decision that you are ready to fire the gun, okay? So, once again, note that I'm pointing the gun in a safe direction, and as I'm handling the gun, I'm keeping my finger off the trigger, and I'm going to do that throughout this video. Okay. The third rule, or fourth depending on how you look at it, is know your target and what is beyond it. Now, this has a few different meanings. Basically, what they're talking about here is understanding that if you're at the range or something and you're shooting at a target, that there's an appropriate backstop and that whatever is behind that backstop is safe as well. In other words, if there's someone behind this big mound of dirt you have in your backyard, it's not going to be safe to shoot at that. You can't just set up a big mound of dirt right up against your house and think it's going to be safe to shoot. It's not. Make sure you know your target as well as what is beyond that target. Now, another application for this rule is a little bit more serious, actually. This is going to be when you're in a situation where you may have to use a firearm to defend yourself, okay? When you're out there in the public, you're going to be responsible for where every single one of your rounds go, okay? So even if you are in a life-threatening situation, keep in mind that you are still liable for where your rounds go. So understanding that there could be someone behind the person you're shooting at, there might be someone around the person you're shooting at. That's why we train, however, and that's why it's so important to be accurate with your, having your fundamentals down and being accurate with your firearm. And if you're not at the point where you feel comfortable doing that, if you're in a defensive situation where you have that potential option to flee, maybe you're concerned about, well, I'm not going to get into the specifics of that. Just understand that it's very important to know your target, what is beyond it, and that does pertain to defensive scenarios as well. And that's something that, you can do a little more research on, as well as discuss with your instructor whenever you take a firearm safety course of any kind, or concealed carry class, or an advanced handgun class. That's something that I know we discuss in a little bit more depth and understanding how to appropriately make those decisions. Now, that's not what this video is about. I just wanted to get some of those safety rules out of the way real quick. What this video, like I said before, is going to be about determining whether or not your firearm is loaded and then unloading the gun. Now, the best way to determine whether or not your firearm is loaded is just to assume that it's loaded, as we mentioned before, and then just go ahead and unload it. Now, this is of course assuming that you're trying to make sure your gun's unloaded before you're going to clean it or store it or whatever the case may be, not doing what is known as like a press check or making sure your gun is loaded before you carry it. That's a different thing we're not going to discuss in this video. So, as I said before, what I have right here is a Glock 19 Gen 3, okay? Now, nope, once again, I'm keeping the gun pointed in a safe direction. It's pointed towards you guys right now, but don't worry, I don't think it's going to make it through the computer screen. And I'm keeping my finger off the trigger. That's very important. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take the magazine out. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with what the magazine is, I'll show you in a moment. But first, I'm going to show you where the magazine release is going to be. On this Glock right here, the magazine release is going to be sort of at the base of the trigger guard where it meets the grip, okay? Now, your magazine release may be a different size depending on your firearm, and it might be in a slightly different location, but generally it's going to be around this area. So if you see that button right there, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take the firearm, I'm going to use my thumb, I'm going to take that magazine out. Notice how it falls right out. It may not fall right out. It may just unlock it, and you may have to pull it out either way. Now, I'm going to go ahead and determine here that this magazine is in fact unloaded, okay? And it doesn't matter if the magazine's unloaded at all, actually. At this point in time, if I'm going to unload the gun, I'm just going to set the magazine off to the side, okay? Because I do not need to put that back in the gun to unload it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, keeping the gun pointed in a safe direction with my finger off the trigger. I'm going to pull back on the slide. Those of you who are not familiar, the slide is going to be this upper portion of the firearm. It's called a slide because, as you're going to see in a moment, it does slide back and forth, basically. And so I go ahead, I pull back on that. Now, if there is a round in there, it should have been extracted. However, we are not going to just trust that the extractor is working properly, okay? So those of you who aren't familiar with what an extractor is, there's basically a claw inside here in the slide that's actually going to pull your round or your spent casing out of the gun. However, we don't want to just assume that that's working properly. We want to go ahead and verify for ourselves that there's not a round in the chamber. Now, this might be a little bit difficult for me to show you in this video due to the lighting, but if you can see in there, you look right in there into where the chamber is going to be. Yeah, you're not going to be able to see that, but there's nothing there to see, so take my word on it. So I've gone ahead and I've determined that there is no round in the chamber, okay? Now, what you can do is you can go ahead and work the slide a couple times if you want. Don't worry, you're not going to harm the gun. It's meant to do that. If you want to do that just for good measure, but ultimately you're just determining that there's no round in there. Now, what I like to do is if I'm in a class or around other people, I'll go ahead and have someone next to me verify as well that it's unloaded. Really just to be extra safe, okay? Now, now that I've gone ahead and made sure the gun's unloaded, remember, we always want to make sure that we're treating the firearm as if it's loaded. So if I need to do, like let's say after I put this gun back together, after cleaning it or something, I want to do a dry fire. Dry fire, for those of you who are not familiar, it's pulling the trigger on the gun when there's no ammunition in the gun. Yes, there's some people say that for certain firearms, it is not good for the gun to do that, but we're not going to get into that right now. So let's say you do want to dry fire the gun to function test it, okay, after cleaning it. What you can do is do everything I just showed you. Go ahead, make sure the gun is in fact unloaded, and then pointing the gun in a safe direction, okay, go ahead and pull that trigger, okay? Now, if you're not comfortable doing that, or if you don't completely understand that, contact somebody. You can contact me or an instructor or somebody who knows a little bit about firearms, and hopefully they can walk you through that process a little bit better. Following it on a video is one thing, but actually doing it on your own for the first time when maybe you've never handled firearms, you know, can be completely different. And the reason I bring this up is because more often than you might think, I'll get people who will contact me and they'll say, you know, a family member has passed away, or, you know, whatever the case may be, and they left me some firearms, but I never handled their firearms, and they're in a safe. I've never shot a gun. I want to go ahead and unload the safe or clean out the closet or whatever. How do I determine whether these guns are unloaded? So this is why I'm doing this video, and for people who are new to guns and want to take a class, who want to have a little bit of better understanding how to do this before they take the class. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how to unload the firearm one more time, and I'm going to show you actually how to do it in a gun that is in fact loaded, the gun I'm carrying right now. So I'm going to set this one off to the side, and I'm going to go ahead and pull out my firearm. Now note, I did pull this gun just out of my holster. It is live. It does have ammunition in the chamber. I'm keeping the gun pointed in a safe direction, as well as keeping my finger off the trigger guard. Okay, so what I'm going to do is this is a Glock 19 as well. It's slightly different than the one I just showed you, but it's very similar. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to take the magazine out. Note that there are rounds in the magazine. That's okay. I'm just going to go ahead and set that off to the side, and then I'm going to go ahead and pull the slide back. Now note that the round did come out, but just for good measure, I am going to go ahead and examine that, pull the slide back a few times. If I had another person here, I would actually lock the slide back to the rear. I'd show it to that individual so they can determine that it's also unloaded, okay? Now that I've determined it's unloaded, I'm going to set that off to the side. I'm going to show you real quick how you'd unload a magazine, okay? Now, with this particular type of magazine, it's going to be different depending on the type of magazine you have, but for the most part, they're all going to work this way. The magazine has a spring in it with a follower on top that is going to force the rounds up as they're cycled through the firearm. So I'm not going to show you how to completely take all the rounds out, but basically for a gun like this, you're going to determine which way is forward. They're only going to come out one way for the most part. And then you're just going to go ahead, and they are on a spring, so they might fly out a little bit. You go ahead and push them out like that. See that? So there. And then you just go ahead and do that until the magazine's loaded. There's a lot of rounds in here. I'm not going to take them all out right now. But for those of you who are interested in doing something like that, that is how you'd unload the firearm and then in fact unload the magazine, okay? Now, if you're going to be working with guns, you're going to be cleaning them or taking them apart or whatever the case may be, best thing to do after you unload the gun is take all the ammunition, put it in a cool, dry place, preferably the box that the rounds came in, or somewhere safe, where they're not going to be subjected to high levels of heat or moisture, and keep them away from the firearm, especially while you're cleaning it. You never want to have a situation like this where you've got ammunition on the table, half-loaded magazine, and you're cleaning up the gun, because what ends up happening is you're just not paying attention, you're messing around with the gun, you end up going ahead, putting a magazine in it, then rack the slide, not thinking about it, and then you end up having a loaded gun and you don't even realize it. It happens more times than you'd think. So hopefully that helped you guys out. If you guys have any questions about that, you can always give me a call. I'm going to put my contact information in the description. As always, guys, stay armed, stay safe, and have a great day.